Something happens the first time. You feel it. A rush, a lift, a release. And your brain does exactly what it was designed to do. It remembers. It marks the moment. It files it under one category. Do this again. That's not a flaw in the system. That's the system working perfectly. The problem is what happens next. Because the second time, the rush is slightly smaller, and the third time, smaller still. And the brain, trying to compensate, starts making changes. Small changes at first, then structural ones, then permanent ones. And somewhere between the first time and the 100th time, what began as a choice stopped being a choice at all. This is the story of how repeated temptation, any destructive pattern, any behavior you keep returning to despite knowing better, physically reshapes the hardware of your mind. Not metaphorically, not spiritually, literally. At the level of proteins and neurons and gene expression. And by the time this video ends, you'll understand something that every major religious tradition has been trying to communicate for thousands of years, expressed in language that neuroscience has only recently been able to verify. That what you do repeatedly, you eventually become. Not by choice, by biology. Let's start with what the brain actually is. Your brain contains approximately 86 billion neurons. Each neuron connects to thousands of others through junctions called synapses. The total number of synaptic connections in a single human brain is estimated at around 100 trillion. 100 trillion. More than all the stars in the Milky Way galaxy, multiplied by 1,000. And every single one of those connections is dynamic. Every experience you have, every thought, every habit, everything you choose to do repeatedly changes the strength of those connections. Strengthens some, weakens others, builds new pathways, prunes ones that aren't being used. This is what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity, and it is simultaneously the most hopeful fact about the human brain and the most dangerous one. Hopeful because it means you can always change. Dangerous because it means you're always changing, whether you intend to or not. You are not a fixed thing. You are a process. And the process is shaped by what you repeatedly do. Now let's talk about the machinery at the center of this story. Deep inside your brain is a structure called the nucleus accumbens. It's small, about the size of a chickpea, and it sits at the intersection of the limbic system, which processes emotion and memory, and the prefrontal cortex, which handles judgment, planning, and impulse control. The nucleus accumbens is the brain's reward hub. It doesn't decide what's pleasurable. It decides what's worth pursuing. And the chemical it runs on is dopamine. You've heard of dopamine. Most people understand it as the pleasure chemical. That's not quite right. Dopamine isn't released when you experience pleasure. It's released in anticipation of pleasure. When you see the notification, when you smell the food, when the craving hits before you've done anything yet. Dopamine is the brain's way of saying, go get that thing. It's the wanting, not the having. The reaching, not the arrival. This distinction is critical, because it means dopamine isn't a reward, it's a signal, a motivational command. And like any system in the body, it can be overloaded, dysregulated, and permanently altered if it's pushed hard enough, long enough. Here's how the overloading begins. Your brain has a baseline level of dopamine activity. In ordinary life, in the pleasure of a good meal, the satisfaction of finishing work, the warmth of a conversation with someone you love, dopamine rises modestly, briefly, and returns to baseline. The system resets. You feel satisfied. You move on. This is how it's supposed to work. But certain behaviors and certain substances don't produce modest rises. They produce surges. A meal produces a gentle lift. Cocaine produces a flood. according to research, elevating dopamine levels in the nucleus accumbens by roughly 10 times their baseline. Highly processed foods, pornography, gambling, social media, each produces dopamine spikes that far exceed what the brain's natural reward circuitry was calibrated to handle. And when you flood a system repeatedly, the system adapts. It has to. It has no choice. In the 1970s, two researchers named Richard Solomon and John Corbett described what they called the opponent process theory. Their observation was elegant. Every strong positive experience, every pleasure, every high, generates an opposite negative experience of roughly equal strength. The brain compensates. It pushes back. It restores balance. That opposite experience is what you feel when the pleasure fades, the crash after the high, the emptiness after the binge, the restlessness after the scroll. The opponent process is always there. You just don't notice it much when the pleasure is modest, because the opponent process is modest too. But here's what Solomon and Corbett found that changes everything. With repeated exposure to the same pleasure stimulus, the original pleasure gets weaker and shorter, while the opponent process, the crash, the craving, the emptiness, gets stronger and longer. Every time you repeat the behavior, you get slightly less pleasure from it and significantly more pain when it's gone. This isn't a moral observation, it's a physiological one. The brain's hedonic set point, its baseline capacity for pleasure, drops. What once felt like joy now feels like relief. What once felt like relief now barely registers. And ordinary life, the quiet, undrugged, unscrolled, ordinary texture of a normal Tuesday, starts to feel like deprivation. Not because ordinary life got worse, because your brain's ability to register pleasure from it has been systematically degraded. Researchers call this anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure from things that used to produce it. And it's not a mood, it's a structural change. The brain, flooded with artificial dopamine signals far beyond its design specifications, responds by reducing the number of dopamine receptors available. It turns down its own sensitivity. It protects itself from the flood by building fewer gates. And now you need more stimulation to reach the same level of response. The dose that used to work doesn't work anymore. This is tolerance. Not just a behavioral pattern, but a measurable physical reduction in your brain's capacity to experience joy. Now let's go deeper, to the molecular level. Because what happens at the cellular level is the part that most people never hear about. And it's the part that explains why some patterns are so extraordinarily difficult to break. Inside the neurons of the nucleus accumbens and the surrounding reward circuitry, something accumulates with repeated behavioral exposure that neuroscientists have been studying for decades. It's a protein called delta phos-B, pronounced delta phos-B. Discovered and extensively studied by neuroscientist Eric Nestler and his colleagues, delta phos-B is a transcription factor, a protein that regulates which genes in your neurons get turned on and which get turned off. It's present in tiny amounts after a single exposure to a rewarding stimulus, but unlike other similar proteins that appear briefly and fade, delta phos-B is extraordinarily stable. It doesn't clear out of the neuron, it stays. And each subsequent exposure adds more. According to research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, delta phos-B accumulates in neurons of the nucleus accumbens and dorsal striatum after repeated administration of virtually all known drugs of abuse. But here's what makes it even more significant. The same accumulation occurs after compulsive running, after compulsive gambling, after any behavior that is repeated compulsively enough to qualify as habitual. Delta phos-B is not a drug response, it's a compulsive behavior response. It doesn't care what you're addicted to. It responds to the repetition. As delta phos-B accumulates, it acts, in Nestler's words, as a sustained molecular switch. It doesn't just change how neurons behave in the moment, it changes which genes those neurons express over the long term. It alters the structure and function of the reward circuitry in ways that persist for weeks, sometimes months, after the behavior has stopped. The changes outlast the behavior. The brain that engaged in the pattern is structurally different from the brain that never did. And those structural differences are measurable on imaging scans long after the last exposure.
Think about what that means.
You make a choice, repeatedly, over weeks or months. Delta Phos B accumulates. It flips genetic switches in your neurons. And now, even after you've stopped, even after the choice is no longer being made, the brain has been physically altered. The molecular record of what you did remains, embedded in your neurobiology, shaping your cravings and your responses, and your vulnerability to relapse. Nestler's research with transgenic mice found that delta Phos B accumulation directly increased sensitivity to the behavioral effects of drugs and increased drug-seeking behavior. The protein doesn't just record the habit, it deepens it. It makes the behavior more compelling the more you engage in it, and harder to escape the longer it's been going on. Meanwhile, another structure is quietly sustaining damage throughout this process.
The prefrontal cortex.
This is the most evolutionarily recent part of the human brain, the region that makes humans distinct from most other animals. It's responsible for what neurologists call executive function, planning, judgment, impulse control, the ability to consider future consequences when making present decisions. It's the part of your brain that says, wait, not yet. Think about this. Is this what you actually want? The prefrontal cortex and the nucleus accumbens are in constant conversation. The nucleus accumbens says, go get that thing now. The prefrontal cortex says, hold on, let's think about this. In a healthy brain, these two regions are in balance. The reward drive exists. The regulatory check exists. Neither dominates completely. Behavior emerges from the negotiation between them. Chronic engagement in high dopamine compulsive behaviors disrupts that balance in a specific and measurable way. Brain imaging studies consistently show that repeated substance use and compulsive behavioral patterns lead to reduced volume, reduced connectivity, and reduced function in the prefrontal cortex. As addiction researcher Psychology Today described it, overactivity of the nucleus accumbens progressively weakens its connectivity to the prefrontal cortex. The executive function region loses its grip on the reward region. The voice that says wait gets quieter. The voice that says now gets louder. And the negotiation that used to produce considered behavior starts producing compulsive behavior instead. Not because you stopped caring about consequences, but because the region of your brain responsible for weighing consequences has been structurally degraded. This is the transition point that researchers identify as the shift from voluntary to compulsive behavior. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens gradually, invisibly, neurologically, across hundreds of repetitions. One day, you realize that you're not choosing the behavior anymore. The behavior is choosing you. And from the outside, that looks like weakness. From the inside, it feels like something that used to be optional has somehow become mandatory. And at the level of brain imaging, it is a real, measurable, structural change. Not a character failure, but a neurological fact. Now here's where this becomes the most important thing you need to understand. Almost every major religious and moral tradition in human history identified this process. In different language, at different levels of abstraction, without the benefit of neuroscience. The concept of sin, in its original meaning across multiple traditions, isn't primarily about individual transgression. It's about patterns, about the cumulative effect of repeated choices on the character and capacity of a person. Thomas Aquinas, writing in the 13th century, described vice as a habit. a disposition that inclines a person towards certain behaviors against their better judgment, and that strengthens with every repetition. Islamic scholars described the nafs, the self, as something that could be trained toward virtue or toward destruction, depending on the patterns you cultivated. Buddhist teaching describes the concept of samskara, mental impressions formed by repeated action that shape perception and desire going forward.
None of these traditions had access to delta phosphor or fMRI imaging or the opponent process theory, and yet every single one of them understood the mechanism that neuroscience has now confirmed. That what you do repeatedly changes what you are. That the pattern shapes the person. That freedom erodes not through a single catastrophic choice, but through the accumulation of small ones, each one slightly restructuring the system that makes the next choice. The language was different. The insight was the same. So where does this leave you? Here is the part of this story that doesn't get told enough. Because the architecture of addiction and compulsive behavior is also the architecture of recovery. And the same neuroplasticity that enables the brain to be reshaped by destructive patterns enables it to be reshaped by constructive ones. A 2019 study published in JAMA Psychiatry found that individuals who maintained sobriety for 6 months showed increased gray matter volume in brain regions associated with self-regulation. The prefrontal cortex, the region that chronic exposure had degraded, began to physically recover. The structural change that made compulsive behavior more likely and considered behavior less likely began to reverse. Not instantly, not completely in every case, but measurably, verifiably, 6 months of different behavior produced a different brain. This is the neurological equivalent of what every tradition of moral formation has taught, that virtue, like vice, is a habit. That the path back is built the same way the path down was built, one choice at a time, each one slightly restructuring the system that makes the next choice. The dopamine system's hedonic set point, which drops with chronic overstimulation, rises again with abstinence and the patient cultivation of low dopamine pleasures. The 70-day without the behavior feels different from the 7th day. Not because the desire has disappeared, but because the brain has gradually recalibrated its sensitivity. The ordinary pleasure of a morning, a conversation, a meal, things that had become invisible against the noise of the high dopamine pattern, begin to register again. Not dramatically, not all at once, but perceptibly, in the way that eyes adjust after coming in from bright light into a dark room. Slowly, then completely. Delta phosphor, despite its stability, is not permanent. According to Nestle's research, the accumulated protein persists in neurons for several weeks after cessation of the behavior, not forever. The genetic switches it flipped don't remain flipped indefinitely. They can be reversed. The molecular record that repeated behavior wrote into the brain can, with sufficient time and different behavior, be partially overwritten. Not erased, but rewritten. The scar exists, but the wound can close. Here is the summary of everything the neuroscience confirms. Your brain is not a fixed object. It is a living record of what you have repeatedly done. Every pattern you engage in, every behavior you return to consistently, regardless of whether it serves you, is physically etched into your neural architecture through the same mechanisms. Dopamine signals reinforcing certain pathways, delta phosphor accumulating and flipping genetic switches, the prefrontal cortex gradually losing its ability to regulate the reward drive that the behavior has trained to be louder and more insistent. The transition from choice to compulsion is not a moral event. It's a neurological one, and it happens slowly, invisibly, in the space between the person you were and the person you are becoming through your habits. This is what the ancient language of sin was always pointing at. Not the single act, the pattern. Not the transgression, the formation. the slow, daily sculpting of a self through the cumulative weight of what you choose to return to, until the choosing, gradually, is no longer the word for what's happening. You are always building something. Every repeated behavior is a construction project. The question isn't whether your brain is being shaped by what you do. It's being shaped right now, constantly, in real time. That's neuroplasticity, and it never stops. The only question is whether you're directing the construction or whether the construction is directing you. The first time something happens, the brain marks it. The second time, it reinforces the mark. The 100th time, the mark has become the architecture. And the architecture determines what feels possible, what feels necessary, and what the person standing inside it is able to choose. That's the sin that rewires your brain. Not the first step, the path. If you want to understand the specific neuroscience behind how recovery actually works, what the brain does during the process of breaking a deeply entrenched pattern, and how long the different stages of neurological recovery actually take, that video is linked right here. And if this kind of content, the kind that connects ancient wisdom to modern science and actually explains why both are pointing at the same thing, subscribe. New videos every week. Drop a comment below with the behavior or pattern this video made you think about. You don't have to name it. Just acknowledge that you thought about it. That acknowledgement is where the path back always starts.